Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. It was an ordinary morning when I sat down to go over my credit card statement. I had just made my usual cup of coffee and was planning to go through the day's errands, but before I started anything else, I decided to check the statement for any unusual charges. I hadn't used my card for anything out of the ordinary, or so I thought. But as I scrolled through the transactions, my eyes froze on one particular entry. A charge had been made at a store I didn't recognize, a place I had never been to in my life. The name of the store was unfamiliar, and the purchase was substantial. It wasn't something I would have bought on a whim, especially not from a place I had no memory of visiting. I immediately checked the date and time of the transaction, trying to remember if I had somehow made a mistake. I had been at home that day, not out shopping, and the purchase certainly didn't match anything on my usual shopping list. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation. Had I lent my card to someone? Was my card information stolen? I called the customer service number on the back of the card immediately, my anxiety growing with every passing second. The representative was polite but firm, asking for details about the transaction. I explained that I hadn't been to the store listed, and I asked if they could provide any further details about the purchase. She placed me on hold for a few minutes before coming back with the unsettling news that the charge had been made in person at the store, with the card physically swiped. There was no record of it being an online transaction or a fraudulent charge from a different location. The news didn't help calm my nerves. The idea that my credit card had been used without my knowledge made my skin crawl. How could this happen? I had my card in my possession, and I hadn't shared it with anyone. I asked if they could provide any further information about the person who made the purchase, but they couldn't release that information for privacy reasons. The only thing I was told was that the purchase had been made at a physical store in a location across town. I wasn't familiar with the area, and the thought of someone walking around with my card made me feel exposed. I ended the call with the customer service representative, but the unease lingered. I felt helpless, as if something had been taken from me, and I couldn't figure out how. I decided to drive over to the store listed in the transaction. If I had never been there, maybe seeing the place in person would help me piece together the puzzle. I needed answers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The store was located in a strip mall, nestled between a few familiar shops I had visited before. It looked like a typical retail store, nothing too unusual about it. The sign outside was brightly lit, with a collection of mannequins in the window displaying the latest merchandise. As I stood there staring at the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't recognize any of the clothes or the style of the store itself. I'd never shopped here, never even noticed it until now. I walked inside, hoping that seeing it up close would jog my memory. The store was spacious, with high shelves filled with items I didn't recognize. There was a soft, ambient music playing in the background, the kind of atmosphere that was meant to make you feel at ease. I walked to the counter and spoke with the cashier, trying to remain calm despite the growing sense of unease in my stomach. I asked if they could check their records and see if a purchase had been made under my name or credit card number. The cashier looked at me with a puzzled expression, and then told me that she couldn't release that kind of information without proper authorization. I left the store feeling frustrated, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. I decided to look around the area more, thinking that maybe there was something I missed. I wandered through the strip mall, my mind still spinning with the possibility that my credit card information had been compromised. But the more I thought about it, the more the situation seemed impossible. How could someone have used my card, physically swiping it at a store, when I hadn't even been there? The day passed in a blur as I tried to make sense of everything. I checked my phone, hoping to find something that might explain the strange purchase. I had no missed calls or messages that could give me any clues. I didn't recognize any names or numbers that might have had something to do with it. But then, as I looked through my photos, something caught my attention. There was a photo I had taken just a few days ago, one I had forgotten about. It was of a store, but not the one from the credit card statement. The store in the photo was familiar, one I'd visited recently with a friend. But when I zoomed in, I realized something strange. The store in the photo had the same logo and branding as the one on my credit card statement. The realization hit me hard. How could I have missed this connection before? The store in my photo wasn't the same one listed on my statement, but they were linked. It was as if the two stores were part of the same chain or owned by the same parent company. It didn't make sense. How could I have visited one without knowing about the other? I went back to my phone and began digging through old texts, trying to trace where I had been a few days ago. That's when I found it. A message from my friend, asking if I wanted to go shopping at a new place they had discovered. It was the store I had visited, but I had no memory of making any purchases there. I thought back to that day. My friend and I had spent hours walking through the mall, browsing through different stores. I had picked up a few things I liked, but I hadn't bought much. But there it was, a charge for a significant purchase at the store I didn't even remember shopping at. When could it be that my friend had bought something for me, using my card? It seemed unlikely, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I decided to reach out to my friend, hoping that they could clear things up. When I called, they answered almost immediately. I asked them if they remembered our shopping trip, and if they had used my credit card to make a purchase. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before they replied, their voice a little too calm. "I didn't buy anything," they said. "Are you sure you didn't make that purchase yourself? Maybe you're just forgetting." I was stunned. Had I really forgotten? The more I thought about it, the more unsure I became. My mind raced, trying to piece together the details, but everything seemed blurry. Had I bought something and not remembered? Or was it possible that my card had been stolen and used on that day without my knowledge? I wasn't sure anymore. As the days passed, I continued to investigate, hoping that somehow I could uncover the truth. I checked my receipts from that day, hoping to find something that could prove I hadn't made the purchase myself. But there was nothing. Everything pointed to one conclusion. I had been the one who made the purchase, but I simply couldn't remember it. It was as if my memory had betrayed me, leaving me with no clear explanation for the charge. Eventually, I let go of the search. I didn't have the answers I wanted, but I knew that sometimes things happen that we can't fully understand. I decided to accept that I might never know what had really happened. Maybe I had made the purchase and forgotten about it, or maybe it was something else entirely. But either way, the mystery was something I had to let go of. I couldn't keep searching for something that might never be found. And so I moved on, knowing that sometimes the truth isn't always as clear as we'd like it to be. Story 2. I was walking down the street, just a normal day, when I heard a voice call out from behind me. It wasn't loud, just a gentle greeting that caught my attention. At first, I thought it was someone I had met recently, someone I recognized, but when I turned around, I saw a man I had never seen before. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking at me with a faint smile on his face. "Hey there, how's it going, kiddo?" he said, using a nickname that made my stomach twist in confusion. The word hung in the air, suspended in time as I stood frozen. Kidda was a name I hadn't heard in years, not since my childhood. It was a nickname my parents had used when I was younger, a term of endearment I had long since grown out of. I couldn't remember the last time I had heard it spoken aloud. The strange part was that I didn't recognize this man at all. His face was unfamiliar, and yet he had addressed me like an old friend, someone he had known for years. My heart began to race as I tried to process what was happening. I stood there, unsure of how to respond. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the situation. How could he possibly know that nickname? I hadn't used it in so long, and I certainly hadn't shared it with anyone outside of my immediate family. Was he someone from my past? A childhood friend, perhaps? But no matter how hard I tried to dig through my memories, I couldn't place him. There was no connection, no reason for him to know that nickname. Yet here he was, standing in front of me like we were old pals. The man must have noticed the confusion in my face because he stepped forward slightly, his expression softening. "Sorry, I guess I should have said something earlier. You probably don't remember me." His voice had a casual, almost apologetic tone, as if he were trying to make me feel at ease. But the uncertainty in his words only deepened my sense of unease. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My eyes scanned his face again, looking for any hint of recognition, any sign that this was someone from my past, but nothing came. He seemed completely ordinary, just a man on the street with nothing about him that stood out. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he waited for my response. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain that I didn't recognize him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all I could do was shake my head slowly, a weak gesture that I hoped conveyed the confusion swirling in my mind. I felt like I should say something more, but I didn't know what. The man studied me for a moment, his gaze seeming to search for some flicker of recognition, and then his smile faded slightly, replaced with a look of mild disappointment. "I guess it's been a long time," he murmured, almost to himself. "You were always so quiet, even back then." His words struck me like a bolt of lightning, making my stomach churn. I had been quiet as a child, but how could he possibly know that? No one outside my family would have remembered that detail. The more he spoke, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't just some random passerby calling me an old nickname. It was someone who seemed to know personal details about me, about my life, that I had kept hidden for years. I took a step back, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, the question coming out in a rush of disbelief. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you." The man blinked, as though the question had caught him off guard. For a moment he didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at me as though weighing his next words carefully. "I thought you'd remember," he said quietly, almost regretfully. "I really thought you would." The sadness in his voice made my heart ache, but it also made me feel even more uncomfortable. I had no idea who he was, but the way he spoke made it feel as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had hoped for a reunion of some kind. I wasn't sure what to do with that feeling, so I just stood there, caught in a strange limbo of confusion and discomfort. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I really don't know you." My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my palms begin to sweat. The man's expression shifted again, this time to something more unreadable, like a mask had fallen over his features. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected my response. But there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy, like a part of him was disappointed or hurt. "It's fine," he said, his tone shifting to one of forced cheerfulness. "I just thought I'd say hello. Anyway, take care." Without waiting for another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been, my mind spinning. Who was he? How did he know me? Why had he called me that nickname? I had no answers, only a growing sense of confusion and unease that seemed to linger in the air like a thick fog. I slowly walked back to my apartment, each step heavier than the last. The more I thought about the encounter, the more questions I had. It was like a part of my past had suddenly resurfaced, uninvited and strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about that moment, something I was missing. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the answers wouldn't come. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the strange way he had spoken to me. I thought about the nickname again, and how it felt so out of place. It was a name I hadn't heard in years, a name that belonged to someone I no longer recognized. Had he really known me, or was it all just some bizarre coincidence? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. What if he had been someone from my past, someone I had long forgotten? But why would he show up out of nowhere, calling me by that name, without any explanation? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, and I heard that nickname echoing in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were no simple answers. I would never know who he truly was, or why he had come into my life again, and part of me wondered if that was for the best. Maybe some things from the past were meant to stay buried. Maybe some encounters were best left unexplained. But the feeling that something important had been left unresolved lingered, and I couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. The man and the name would stay with me, a reminder that sometimes the past has a way of creeping back into the present, unexpected and strange. Story 3. It started like any other day. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the neighborhood. I had just finished my morning routine, the familiar steps of brewing coffee, eating breakfast, and checking my emails. The world outside seemed to be in its usual rhythm, peaceful and normal. I was about to step outside to get some fresh air when something caught my eye, a small glint from the flower pot on my neighbor's porch. Curious, I walked over to their yard, thinking perhaps a piece of something shiny had fallen into the pot. As I approached, I noticed the gleam wasn't from some random object, but from a small, familiar shape. I reached down and, to my utter shock, found my house key lying there among the soil and flowers. It was unmistakably mine. There was a small scratch on the side where I had dropped it once, long ago, and the keychain was one I had chosen for its simple design. But I had never been to my neighbor's yard. In fact, I had never even spoken to them outside of the occasional greeting when we passed each other on the sidewalk. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could my key end up in their flower pot? I was sure I had not dropped it there myself. I hadn't even been close to their yard in weeks. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would someone place my key there? Was it possible that my key had somehow slipped out of my bag while I was in the area, though I couldn't recall even walking near their house? My mind raced with all kinds of theories, none of them comforting. I stood there for a moment, staring at the key, trying to make sense of the situation. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. I picked up the key, turning it over in my hand as if hoping that somehow it would explain itself. But there were no answers, only more questions. Why would anyone have access to my house key? And why leave it in my neighbor's yard? I didn't know what to think, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I needed to figure out what had happened. I decided to go back inside, but the weight of the key in my hand felt like a symbol of something unsettling. I hadn't used the key in a few days, only the front door had been unlocked on occasion. I'd always been careful with it, keeping it hidden in a secure spot. Yet somehow, here it was, in a place I knew it should never have been. My heart raced as I considered the possibility that someone had been inside my house, or perhaps they had gained access to my belongings in some other way. What disturbed me even more was the idea that I didn't know if I could trust anyone around me. I'd always thought of my neighbors as friendly, but how could I be sure? I hadn't even seen them in days, and the thought of someone having access to my home without my knowledge felt like a violation. I turned the key over again in my hand, the small metallic object now seeming heavier than before, its presence a reminder that something wasn't right. The thought of calling someone for help crossed my mind, but who would I call? I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I also didn't want to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. After a few moments of standing still, I finally walked back into my house and placed the key on the kitchen counter. My thoughts were racing. What if I had been careless? What if I had dropped it without realizing, and someone else had found it? But then I remembered, no, I hadn't been careless. I hadn't dropped it anywhere. I had always been careful. So how had it ended up there? And more importantly, who had placed it in my neighbor's flower pot? I felt a sense of urgency building within me. It wasn't just the key, it was everything that felt wrong about the situation. The more I thought about it, the more isolated I felt. My house, my sanctuary, the one place where I should feel safe, suddenly didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. I considered asking my neighbor about it, but the idea of confronting them felt like an invasion of their privacy. And what if they didn't know anything either? What if they had no idea how my key ended up in their yard? The next few hours passed in a blur as I tried to go about my day, but the events weighed on me. The memory of the key sitting in the flower pot replayed in my mind over and over again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Had I missed something? Had I somehow overlooked a sign that there was something or someone in my life I couldn't trust? I couldn't help but wonder if there had been other clues, small moments where things hadn't seemed right, but that I had dismissed as nothing. Later that afternoon, as I was walking back from the grocery store, I noticed something unusual. A piece of paper was stuck to my front door. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity pulled me closer. I peeled the paper from the door, and as I unfolded it, I found only a single line written in dark ink: "I know where you are." My stomach dropped, and the blood seemed to drain from my face. The message was short, cryptic, and chilling. I felt like I was suffocating as my mind scrambled to make sense of it. I turned back to the house, scanning the area around me, looking for any signs of movement. There was nothing, no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't know what to do. My hand shook as I held the paper, the words still echoing in my mind. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand, and I didn't know if I was ready to face it. I debated calling for help, but I wasn't sure who to call. Would anyone believe me if I told them about the key in the flower pot, the message on my door? I didn't even know if I believed it myself. My hands were clammy, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I decided to take action. The first step was to check my house for anything unusual. I went through each room methodically, making sure every window was locked, every door secure. Everything seemed to be in order, but that didn't put my mind at ease. The more I searched, the more I felt a sense of dread creeping over me. Was someone inside watching me, or was I just losing my grip on reality? I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house seemed amplified in the stillness of the dark. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening for any sounds that might betray the presence of someone or something lurking nearby. The hours dragged on, and as the first light of morning filtered through the blinds, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes, if only for a moment. The next few days were a blur of unease and suspicion. I kept checking my locks, walking around the house nervously, and trying to make sense of the strange events that had occurred. I avoided my neighbor, unsure of what to say or how to approach them. The key, the paper, and the growing feeling that something was wrong weighed on me constantly. And no matter how much I tried to push it to the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was just beyond my reach, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. In the end, I never did find out how my key ended up in the flower pot, or who had left that cryptic message on my door. I never confronted my neighbor, and I never spoke to anyone about it. The fear that had once gripped me slowly faded into the background, but the lingering sense of unease remained. I locked my doors every night, checked my windows before bed, and kept my distance from the world outside. The house felt like a cage, but it was the only place I could be. And while I learned to live with the mystery, the thought that someone knew where I was, and maybe always had never quite left me, I couldn't escape the feeling that the strange events were far from over, and that I had only scratched the surface of a deeper mystery. Something was still out there, watching, waiting. Story 4. I walked into the office building that morning, just like any other day. The usual hum of fluorescent lights above, the soft click of my shoes on the tiled floor, and the smell of coffee brewing in the break room were all comforting signs that my day was beginning. I approached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited as the doors opened. It wasn't until I reached the floor where my office was located that I noticed something strange. The door to my office was slightly ajar, something that never happened. I always made sure to lock it when I left the night before, and I was the last to leave. I stood there, staring at the door for a moment. My heart started to race as I tried to make sense of the situation. Why could I have forgotten to lock it? No, I was certain I had locked it. The distinct click of the lock echoing in my mind was something I always paid attention to. I had been careful, but now, standing in front of my office with the door wide open, I felt a strange chill creeping down my spine. It was early, and no one else should have been in the building. I hesitated before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The room looked just as it always did. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. My desk was cluttered with papers, my computer screen still dimmed from the night before, and the chair behind my desk was slightly turned, as if someone had been sitting there. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the faint smell of something unfamiliar in the air, a scent I couldn't quite place. It was as if something had been in the room with me, something I didn't expect. I walked over to the desk, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, and started to scan the room more closely. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My desk drawers were all closed as they should have been. I checked my computer, and nothing seemed to have changed. But then, something caught my eye. On the corner of my desk, there was a piece of paper that I hadn't left there. It wasn't one of my notes or memos. It looked like a rough draft of some sort, written in hurried, uneven handwriting. I picked it up, feeling a twinge of unease in my stomach. It wasn't my handwriting. I couldn't recognize the scrawl, but the words on the page were simple. They're watching. Be careful. My mind raced. Who could have been in here? The building was locked down at night, and the security system required a keycard to access the floor. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without it. I turned to look around the room again, scanning the corners and the shelves. But the office was just like it had always been, quiet and unassuming. I thought back to the night before. I had stayed late to finish a project, and I made sure everything was in order before leaving. I even remembered locking the door behind me, yet someone had been here. Someone had been in my office. I sat down at my desk, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had to think this through logically. Maybe I had simply forgotten to lock the door. But no, that didn't explain the paper. I had never seen that before. And the smell, the feeling of someone else's presence, it couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't like me to jump to conclusions, but something didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around again, this time more slowly, looking for any signs of disturbance. But there was nothing. Nothing except that note. I had to figure out what was going on. I decided to call the security company that managed the building. I explained the situation to the person on the other end of the line and asked if there had been any breaches overnight. After a long pause, the person informed me that the security cameras on my floor had been down for maintenance the previous evening. The maintenance work had finished around midnight, but the system hadn't been fully operational until 8 a.m. that morning. This sent a cold shiver down my spine. The idea that someone could have entered my office during that time without being recorded made my blood run cold. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. Who could have done this? I hung up the phone and sat in silence, trying to process the new information. It was clear now that the door had been opened while the cameras were down. But why? Who would want to enter my office, and what were they looking for? I didn't have any personal enemies, no one who would have any reason to invade my space. I thought about the note again. They're watching. Be careful. What did that mean? Who was watching, and why? I needed to know. I quickly sent an email to my boss, explaining what had happened and asking if anyone else had experienced something similar. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I had to be cautious. If someone else had been targeted, it could mean something bigger. But my boss's reply came back quickly and bluntly. She told me to drop it and not worry, that it was probably just an employee prank. That response only made me feel more uneasy. If it was just a prank, why didn't anyone else know about it? Why was it just me? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to focus on my work but constantly glancing at the door, at the chair behind my desk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The office was too quiet, too still. Around noon, I decided to leave for lunch, hoping to clear my head. As I walked toward the elevator, I couldn't help but notice how empty the halls were. The building was usually bustling with people, but today it felt like a ghost town. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, trying to push all the strange thoughts out of my mind. When I returned to the office later that afternoon, something had changed. The door was still unlocked, but now there was a sense of tension in the air. The room felt different, like someone had been there again. I stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitant to enter. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, someone hiding in the shadows or the possibility that I was losing my mind. But I couldn't stand there forever. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was that the note was gone. The paper I had seen earlier was no longer on my desk. I rushed to check the drawers, the shelves, but there was nothing. Had I imagined it? It had been a trick of my mind. But I knew what I had seen. I had to be sure. My eyes scanned the office once more, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I noticed it on the corner of my desk, a small item that hadn't been there before. It was a tiny, folded piece of paper. I picked it up cautiously, unfolding it with trembling hands. The words written inside were brief. Next time it won't be so easy. I stared at the note, the blood draining from my face. My head spun, and I felt lightheaded. This wasn't a prank anymore. It was a warning, a threat. Whoever had been in my office wasn't done, and now I realized neither was I. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the office another minute. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. I grabbed my coat and rushed toward the door. But as I opened it, I froze. Standing just outside, I could see a figure, someone I didn't recognize, someone standing completely still, watching me. The moment our eyes met, the figure turned and disappeared into the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed out of the office, not caring about anything else. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet, and I wasn't going to wait to find out what would happen next. Story 5. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of night that felt familiar in the best possible way. I had just finished dinner and was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, when I realized I needed to head out for an appointment I had almost forgotten about. It wasn't far, but I didn't feel like driving, so I decided to order a rideshare to make the trip easier. I opened the app, entered my destination, and tapped the button to request a ride. I waited, watching the dots on the screen moving as the car made its way toward me. The few minutes it took for the car to arrive felt like an eternity. I kept checking the app, making sure I had entered the correct pickup location, and glancing out the window to see if I could spot the car in the distance. The streetlights outside flickered as I waited, their yellowish glow casting a soft light across the room. It wasn't until I heard the soft hum of an engine approaching that I looked up to see the headlights illuminating the sidewalk. It was then that I saw it, the car slowing down in front of my house. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for the notification that my driver had arrived. But as I looked out the window, I saw the car come to a stop in front of my house, and a man got out. He wasn't wearing a typical driver's uniform, just a plain t-shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he moved that caught my attention. He walked toward my door with a purposeful stride, and before I could even get up to meet him, he spoke. "You're late," he said, his voice calm and steady, almost as if he had been expecting me. I froze, staring at him from the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could he know I was going to be late? I hadn't even requested a ride yet. The words seemed to echo in my mind as I quickly checked the rideshare app again. Sure enough, the request hadn't even been completed, yet here he was, standing on my doorstep, waiting for me. Confusion flooded my mind, and I stood there, unsure of what to do. I had never had an experience like this before. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside to meet the driver. His car, a dark sedan, was parked right in front of my house. He had already started to walk back to the driver's side, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and strange. Something wasn't right. I felt a strange pull toward him, as though there was something important I was missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "You're sure you didn't request a ride?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. The man turned back to me with a calm expression, one that seemed to carry an unsettling weight. He nodded, but there was something about the way he moved that didn't feel right. It was almost as if he already knew what I was going to ask. "No, I haven't requested anything yet," I added, still trying to make sense of the situation. "Well," he said, almost as if he was pondering something, "maybe it's just an accident. You're still coming with me, right?" His words felt rehearsed, calculated. His gaze never left me as he spoke, and I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. How did he know? How did he already know that I was about to get in the car? I glanced down at my phone again, but this time the app had already updated. The ride had been requested, the car was marked as arriving soon, yet the ride itself had not been booked by me. I stood there for a moment, feeling completely disoriented. "How" was the only word that escaped my mouth. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together. There had to be some explanation, something logical that I had missed, but nothing made sense. He had arrived before the ride was even requested, and he seemed so certain that I was already late. The man's eyes flickered briefly, and then he smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't a comforting smile, but rather one filled with an almost predatory calm. "Just get in the car," he said, his voice taking on a gentler tone now. "We don't have much time." There was no denying the oddness of the situation, but for some reason I found myself following him toward the car. It felt as though my feet were moving without my permission, my body moving of its own accord. I had an overwhelming sense that something important was happening, something I couldn't understand yet, but I needed to be in that car. As I climbed into the back seat, the world outside seemed to fade away, and for a brief moment, everything felt surreal. The inside of the car was just as I expected, a typical rideshare vehicle, clean but nothing extraordinary. The man climbed into the front seat, and the engine roared to life. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but he didn't meet my eyes. He seemed completely focused on the road ahead, as though everything was already decided. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being guided, pushed forward by forces I couldn't control. My phone buzzed again, and I checked the screen, half expecting to see some sort of notification. But nothing had changed. It was just the usual messages from friends and work. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The ride was silent, and the car moved through the city with an eerie smoothness. Every turn felt preordained, every stoplight green when we approached. I had no idea where we were going, but it didn't seem to matter. The further we drove, the more I felt as though I was entering a different reality, one where everything was out of my control. The city streets passed by, the familiar landmarks becoming strange and distant. It was as if I were moving through a dream, but I couldn't wake up. "What's happening?" I finally asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. My voice was shaky, and I realized how absurd the question sounded. The man didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his tone was soft and deliberate, as though he were explaining something simple. "You don't need to worry about it," he said, almost soothingly. "You're here now, and that's what matters." There was something in his voice that made my stomach twist. It wasn't comforting, but rather the opposite. It was as though he were reassuring me about something that I had no reason to be reassured about. I turned to look out the window, my thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of the situation. The car slowed as we approached a large, dark building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a place I recognized. There were no lights, no signs, just an ominous shadow looming in the distance. My pulse quickened. I hadn't agreed to any destination, and yet here we were, stopping in front of a place I couldn't even identify. The man glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "We're here," he said. "This is where you need to be." I felt my heart race in my chest, a wave of panic rising inside me. I didn't want to go inside, but at the same time, something was pulling me toward the building. It was as if I had no choice. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I was meant to be here, in this moment. Slowly, the door to the car opened, and I stepped out, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The man got out too, and together we walked toward the dark building, my mind swirling with questions I couldn't quite form. As we entered the building, I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The interior was dimly lit, and there was an odd hum in the air, as though something was alive within the walls. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. Everything had led me to this moment, and there was no turning back. Finally, the man turned to me with a calm smile. "You're not late," he said quietly. "You were always meant to arrive exactly when you did." I looked at him, confusion and fear flooding my chest. and in that moment, I realized that I had no idea what was really happening. But I knew one thing for sure: the moment I stepped into that car, my life had changed forever. Story 6. It was one of those nights when sleep felt deeper than usual, where even the smallest sound seemed muffled by the weight of exhaustion. I had gone to bed late, having spent the entire evening finishing up a few tasks I had been putting off for days. The clock had already struck well past midnight when I finally turned off the light and curled up under the covers. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I opened my eyes again, the first rays of daylight were starting to filter through the blinds. As I reached over to grab my phone and check the time, something caught my attention. The screen of my phone was glowing, and I noticed a notification that there was a voice memo saved. I frowned, confused. I didn't remember recording anything the night before. In fact, I had been in bed and asleep for hours. I glanced at the time on my phone, and my heart skipped a beat. The voice memo was dated 3 a.m., exactly the hour when I had been sound asleep, lost in the depths of slumber. I couldn't fathom how it had been created, and a sense of unease began to creep into my thoughts. Curiosity pushed me to press play. The soft crackle of static filled the silence before a voice emerged from the speaker. My heart raced, my grip tightening around the phone as I tried to listen closely. The voice on the recording was unmistakably mine, but I knew I hadn't spoken it. There were no words I could recall uttering in the middle of the night, let alone recording them. The voice was muffled, distant, as if coming from somewhere inside my room, but not from my own mouth. It was a strange mixture of familiar and foreign, like a part of me I didn't recognize. As the recording played on, I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The words didn't make any sense to me at first. The voice on the tape spoke in fragmented sentences, and though they seemed to be in my own voice, the tone was eerie and almost unnatural. The words were disjointed, as if I were speaking without fully understanding what I was saying. There were pauses, some long, some short, as though I was trying to remember something, or perhaps waiting for something. It was impossible to tell. The unsettling nature of the voice sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of dread that I couldn't quite place. I stopped the recording before it finished, my fingers trembling slightly as I placed the phone on the bed beside me. I had to calm down. It could be a glitch, I reasoned. Maybe it was a prank, or something else easily explained away. But the way my voice sounded, the things it had said, left me feeling far from reassured. I picked the phone back up, replaying the message several times, trying to find any explanation for what I was hearing. But no matter how many times I listened, it didn't make sense. The voice on the recording didn't sound like something I would say. It was as if someone had been using my voice to speak in a way that didn't belong to me. The strangest part was the memory of the night before. I could vividly remember going to bed and falling asleep without any disturbances. There were no dreams, no restless tossing or turning. It had been a peaceful night. So how had a voice memo been recorded on my phone in the middle of the night? I tried to think back to anything that might explain it, but nothing came to mind. I felt like I was grasping at thin air, trying to find a logical reason for something that didn't seem to have one. As I sat there, staring at the phone in my hands, a small part of me wondered if I had somehow recorded the message without realizing it. Could I have spoken in my sleep? It didn't seem possible. I had never had any memory of sleep talking, let alone sleep recording. But the idea of sleepwalking recording something while unconscious was unsettling in its own right. What had I been trying to say in my sleep? What had my mind been trying to communicate? A growing sense of unease settled in my stomach as I began to analyze the recording further. There was something off about the voice, something I couldn't pinpoint. The words didn't seem to be mine, even though they were spoken in my voice. I had never said them before. They were strange and disjointed, like an incomplete sentence, as though my mind had been attempting to tell me something it couldn't fully express. It was almost as if the recording was a message, something left behind without any clear context or meaning. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something unknown, and I couldn't make sense of it. Well, the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the situation became. I tried to remember if I had used any voice memos recently, but nothing came to mind. I had no memory of creating one, and yet here it was, stored on my phone at an hour when I had been asleep. The logical part of my mind tried to tell me it was nothing to worry about. It could have been a glitch, an accidental tap on the phone screen, but the voice on the recording didn't feel like an accident. It felt deliberate, as if someone had known exactly what to say, how to say it, and when to say it. I sat in silence for a while, the recording replaying in my head. My eyes darted around the room, as if expecting to find some clue, some explanation hidden in plain sight. But everything was exactly as it had been the night before. The room was still, undisturbed. Nothing looked out of place. And yet the recording remained, a persistent reminder of something I couldn't explain. My thoughts were clouded, and I felt a sense of urgency building within me. I had to know what was going on, what had happened that night. I started to check my phone's settings, looking for any sign of what could have triggered the recording. I scrolled through my apps, searching for something I might have missed. The more I searched, the more frustrated I became. There was no indication of how the recording had been made. My phone was not malfunctioning, and there were no apps open that could explain it. It was as if the recording had appeared out of thin air without any logical explanation. At some point, I decided to reach out to someone to get another opinion on what had happened. I wasn't sure who to turn to, though. The idea of telling anyone about a voice memo on my phone that I hadn't recorded seemed absurd. What would I even say? How could I explain it? But in the end, I called a close friend, hoping that talking to someone would help me make sense of it all. She listened patiently as I explained the situation, though I could hear the skepticism in her voice as I spoke. She suggested that I might have accidentally recorded it in my sleep, a suggestion I had already considered. But her voice was comforting, and for a moment, I felt like I wasn't alone in this strange experience. I decided to go about my day, though the unease didn't leave me. I tried to push the voice memo out of my mind to focus on my usual routine, but each time I picked up my phone, I couldn't help but feel a pang of dread. The recording was still there, lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. I wasn't sure what it meant or why it had happened, but the sense that something wasn't quite right remained. I couldn't help but wonder if the recording had been a warning, or if it was just a bizarre fluke. All I knew was that something had happened, something I couldn't explain, and for the first time I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. Story 7. And I boarded the bus early that morning, just as I always did. The world was still dim and quiet, the streets almost empty except for a few cars and the occasional jogger. I took my usual seat by the window, staring out at the waking city, letting the hum of the bus lull me into a kind of peaceful trance. The ride was uneventful at first, just the sound of tires rolling over the pavement and the soft murmur of conversations between other passengers. The bus had only a handful of people on it, most of them keeping to themselves as the day slowly began. As we passed by familiar landmarks, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was routine for me, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. I had taken the same route for months, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary until today. I felt a slight chill despite the warmth of the morning, and my attention shifted from the window to the seat beside me. There, sitting quietly, was a person I had never seen before. They were unremarkable in appearance, just a person like any other. A middle-aged man with a worn leather jacket and a hat pulled low over his eyes, sitting with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face was pale, his features hard to make out in the dim light. As the bus continued on its route, I tried to dismiss the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I turned my gaze back to the window, trying to focus on the scenery as it passed by. But something about this stranger was beginning to bother me. I could feel his presence, as though he were watching me, though I didn't dare glance back at him. My heart rate picked up, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Then, in a voice so soft that it barely made a sound over the hum of the bus, he whispered, "They know what you did." My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly, pretending to look out the window again, but my mind raced. The words felt like a sharp jolt to my system, sending a wave of panic through me. The stranger hadn't moved. His hands were still folded in his lap, and his eyes, hidden under the brim of his hat, never met mine. It was as if he hadn't even said anything, yet the weight of his words lingered in the air between us. I tried to ignore the feeling that was rising in my chest, tried to tell myself that it was nothing, just some random comment from a person I'd never see again. But the more I tried to push it away, the more the words echoed in my mind. "They know what you did." What did that mean? Who was this person? And why did his words feel so personal, so intimate, as though he had peered into my very soul? The bus made its usual stops, picking up a few more passengers as the ride continued. But no one else seemed to notice the stranger, nor did they seem to hear what he had said. The chatter of other passengers filled the air, but none of it reached me. I was lost in my thoughts, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't. So why did his words send such a ripple of fear through me? I kept my gaze fixed on the window, trying to focus on the passing streetlights, the trees, anything to distract myself. But every time my thoughts began to settle, his voice would creep back into my mind. "They know what you did." I couldn't shake it. I couldn't understand it. The bus made another stop, and the stranger rose from his seat. For a moment I thought he might be leaving, but instead he walked slowly to the front of the bus, his footsteps almost silent on the floor. As he passed by, I caught a glimpse of his face for the first time. His eyes were dark and hollow, his skin pale as though he hadn't seen the sun in years. There was something unsettling about his expression, something that made my stomach churn. He didn't look at anyone else, his gaze was fixed straight ahead, and his movements were deliberate, almost unnervingly so. The bus began to pick up speed as we entered a more populated area of the city, but my mind was still racing. I couldn't focus on anything else. I glanced around the bus to see if anyone else seemed to notice the stranger, but no one seemed to care. They were all lost in their own worlds, absorbed in their phones, reading newspapers or chatting quietly. No one else seemed to be disturbed by the man or his words. It wasn't long before he reached the front of the bus, and I thought for a moment that he was going to leave. But instead, he turned and walked down the aisle toward the back, his steps slow and measured. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. What was he doing? Why was he coming back this way? My palms began to sweat, and I clenched my fists, trying to calm myself. I knew I needed to get off the bus to escape, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or foolish. Just as I was about to stand up and move toward the door, the stranger stopped right next to me. He leaned in close, so close that I could smell the faint scent of tobacco on his breath. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. His voice was low and almost soothing, but the words he spoke made my skin crawl. "They know," he whispered again, his tone insistent this time. "They know what you did, and they're watching." They're always watching. The world seemed to tilt around me, and I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to scream, to run, to get away from him, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment with him. His eyes locked onto mine for the briefest of seconds, and it was as though he could see right through me, as though he knew every secret I had buried deep inside. Then, just as suddenly as he had come, the stranger stepped back, his face returning to its neutral expression. He turned and walked to the door, as though nothing had happened. He didn't look back. The bus came to a stop, and I stumbled off, barely able to keep my composure. My mind was spinning. Who was he? What did he mean? And most importantly, what did he know? I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The cool air hit my face, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I told myself that it was nothing, that it was just some strange encounter with a random person. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to this than I could understand. As I made my way to work, the words echoed in my head. They know what you did. I didn't understand what he meant, but the fear in my chest refused to fade. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, a feeling that stayed with me as I went through my day, lingering like a shadow. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that I was being watched. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so vulnerable, so exposed. I had no idea who the stranger on the bus had been, or what he had meant by his words. But I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same again. There was no going back from this. Story 8. It was early in the morning, just after I had brewed my coffee and sat down to check my emails. As usual, I opened my bank app, glancing over the recent transactions to make sure everything was in order. I had just finished reviewing the last few charges when something caught my eye. There was a withdrawal for a large sum of money taken from a city I had never been to. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen, my mind racing to figure out how this could have happened. I quickly opened the transaction details, hoping for some sort of explanation. The date and time were listed, along with the name of the business or ATM where the withdrawal had been made. But I didn't recognize any of it. The city, the location, it was all unfamiliar to me. My mind started to spiral. How could someone withdraw money from my account in a place I had never even visited? I had been careful with my account details, had I not? I immediately checked my recent activities, trying to pinpoint any moment where my account could have been compromised. After a few minutes of frantic scrolling, I realized that there was nothing in my recent transactions that seemed out of place, except for this one withdrawal. I had not lost my wallet, nor had I shared my account information with anyone. I wasn't expecting a large withdrawal to be processed, and yet here it was, sitting in front of me on my screen like a strange glitch in my otherwise orderly life. My hands felt clammy, and I began to think back to the last few days. Had I done anything unusual? Nothing came to mind. The only thing that seemed out of place was this unexpected transaction, but it was enough to make me feel like something was terribly wrong. I quickly opened the customer service number for my bank and dialed. As the phone rang, I tried to calm myself, but the worry in my stomach only grew. When a representative finally answered, I explained the situation in as much detail as I could. I told her about the unauthorized withdrawal from a city I had never visited. She asked me for my account number and other identifying details, which I provided. After a few minutes of silence on the other end, she came back with a question that took me by surprise. Have you recently traveled anywhere, or perhaps used your card online for a purchase from that city? She asked. I felt my chest tighten. No, I hadn't traveled anywhere recently, and I hadn't made any online purchases from a store or service based in that city. I told her as much, my voice shaky with unease. The representative seemed to be typing something in the background as she asked if I had made any recent purchases or transactions that could have led to this withdrawal. But no, nothing seemed to match. We're going to have to investigate this further, she said. I'll file a claim for fraud on your account and send you an email confirming the action. She reassured me that the charge would be investigated, but I was left with a lingering feeling of dread. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to go about my normal routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mystery withdrawal. I felt vulnerable, as if someone had seen into a part of my life that I had never shared with anyone. Even though the bank had promised to investigate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through the cracks. I kept checking my bank account, looking for any other discrepancies, but there was nothing except for the fact that this strange withdrawal remained unresolved. One afternoon, about a week later, I received an email from the bank with an update on the case. My stomach tightened as I opened it, half expecting more bad news. But the email didn't offer any answers. Instead, it included a brief statement confirming that they had been unable to